Welcome to Chapter 4, Part 1, on which foreign markets will be successful for your product. Here's a graphic of the world as 100 people. If the world were 100 people, 50 would be female, 50 male, 26 would be children, 74 adults, 8 of them would be 65 and older, and you can see the breakdown by ethnicity, by religion, by language, by literacy, and by shelter and nutrition. So the world's a diverse place, but it begs the question, out of all this diversity, which countries are appropriate for your product? And that's what we'll tackle today. So in the first video, we'll look at two broad sets of indicators. Specifically, we'll look at demographic and macroeconomic indicators. But first, I want to talk about looking at the past. One of the things you could do if you have experience is look at what has worked for you in the past. And in fact, this is a screenshot from a video on how to make international sales without leaving the US that discusses the International Buyer Program. So I'm going to link that video so you can take a look at that. You can jump from this video to that one by clicking on the hyperlink. I think you'll find that interesting. The problem with looking at the past, however, is because the world is changing so fast and your industry may be changing rather quickly with it, that may actually be misleading. So I would actually advocate a more proactive approach of asking yourself some really challenging questions about your company and your industry, and then looking proactively at various types of indicators to get a feel for what markets might be appropriate. So for our next group analysis, we'll take a look at the questions to identify indicators for foreign market success. And I would encourage you to take a look at page 41 of your text for examples of each one of these to drill down a little bit further. Moving forward, as I said, we'll look at demographic indicators and macroeconomic indicators in section 1, and then in the next video, we'll take a look at government policies because I have a lot to say on that topic. In terms of demographic indicators, we'll look at population, gender makeup, literacy, education levels, and per capita income and distribution. So any thoughts on where you might find this information? You know, let's say that you're interested in, let's say Mexico, that you're considering that market for chocolates. The first day of class, somebody had indicated that he's interested in chocolates, so let's talk about that a bit. Where would you find that information? Well, interestingly enough, we may or may not trust everything that the CIA does, but they do gather very, very good intelligence. And in fact, one of the very first places that I advocate you look for information for foreign market research is the CIA World Factbook, which I'm showing you right here. And you can see, and I jump to Mexico. You can type in the name of the country right here, or just scroll down the list, and it'll bring us to our country of interest, which is Mexico. And you can see that then the information is subdivided further. Some introduction, some geography, people and society, government, economics, etc. So looking back at the list of factors that your author encourages you to consider, the first one is population, including growth and density. So obviously this is important if you're looking for a large enough market to be profitable. One of the first factors you'd ask yourself is, what's the population of this country? Is there enough people to consume my product? So looking at Mexico, where would you assume, if you're using the CIA World Factbook, that you would find that information? You probably said under people and society, so let's take a look at that. And in fact, it does show us the population of 120,286,655 people as of July 2014. So the other thing I like about the CIA World Factbook is that the numbers tend to be fairly up to date. And I should digress a minute and say, well, why not just Google it? Why not just go online? Why not see what the government of Mexico has to say? Well, a couple of things. You've probably noticed that when you just Google things and go to some random site, sometimes the information is reliable and sometimes it's not. And especially things like this. If a government is putting out information, they do have a vested interest, especially if they're trying to attract foreign direct investment, of portraying themselves in a positive light. So I would encourage you to use either the CIA World Factbook or the World Bank Economic Indicators, which we'll look at in about a week or so. So you might say, okay, that's the population of Mexico. How does that compare to the rest of the world? So the other thing that I like about the CIA World Factbook is it gives us a nice link. And then generally it'll give us a list so we can see exactly where our country of interest ranks. And as you can see on this list, Mexico is number 12. So what do you think? Fairly populous country, I would say. So going back to the other factors to consider, what about gender? What's the gender makeup, and where do you think you'd find that? Well, once again, I would say let's go to people, and if we scroll down a little bit, you can see we have some really, really rich information. It gives us the age structure, and based on that, we can see that Mexico has a fairly young population. So something you might want to consider, depending on your product, if you're looking for a market for items targeting children or young families, this might be a viable place. Compare and contrast that to Japan, which has an aging population. So something to consider. Okay, so it gives us a bit more detail, including the sex ratio. A lot of nice detail here. So coming back to our other questions, what about literacy rate? And once again, I won't belabor the point and jump back and forth and back and forth, but the CIA World Factbook does a very good job on literacy rates and education levels. So let's look at income. Chocolate, as you're probably aware, is not a necessity. Actually, it might feel like one, but it's not a necessary item. So you'd have to have a fairly reasonable disposable income in a country for them to purchase chocolate. So let's look at Mexico, and let's look at some of their economic variables. How would we measure that? Well, one way of measuring a country's economy is GDP, or gross domestic product, which is how much is produced in the country. So we can see that in 2013, Mexico's GDP was $1.845 trillion. Well, seemingly not bad. But it might be more meaningful to take a look at that on a per person basis. So to do that, we can scroll down and look at GDP per capita, which means gross domestic product per person. And the way that that number is derived is by taking the GDP of the country and dividing it by the population. So we can see the GDP per capita, and let me digress for a minute and talk about PPP. If you compared, let's say, GDP in Mexico to the United States, it might be a little bit misleading. So to make those numbers the same, we use something called PPP, or purchasing power parity, to give us equivalent figures. So the GDP per capita in equivalent figures to the United States is $15,600 in 2013. So you might say, well, okay, what does that mean? How does that compare to the rest of the world? Well, compared to the rest of the world, it's 88. Okay, so we can see there's, starting at the top, there are a lot of countries that are more affluent than Mexico, that's for sure, although obviously there are quite a few that are below it as well. So back to our question, does chocolate make sense? Well, I think there's one more figure that we have to add, and that is looking at it in terms of wealth distribution. Because we saw a minute ago that Mexico has a reasonably large population. However, it's not a terribly affluent country, but that's misleading if we just look at GDP or GDP per capita. We need to drill down a little bit further and say, well, how is wealth distributed? Okay, and the figure that we use for that is something called the Gini coefficient. And I'm scrolling down, seeing if I could find it. I'm jumping around a little bit. The Gini coefficient measures how stratified wealth is. In other words, if everybody in a country has about the same amount of money, then the Gini coefficient would be 0. The opposite of that is if we have a highly, highly stratified country where you've got, let's say most people living in abject poverty, but you've got a tiny, tiny, tiny group of extremely affluent people at the tippy top of the economic pyramid, then that would be a Gini coefficient of 100. Oh, here we go. So here's the Gini index, for Mexico. It's 48.3. And once again, you might say, well, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, let's compare it to the rest of the world. So it looks like it's 24th compared to the rest of the world. So this is interesting, because if we go up, then we're actually looking at more stratification. So compared to South Africa, Mexico is actually more equal. South Africa is very, very stratified, which doesn't surprise me. Mexico is more stratified than a lot of countries. So these are countries that have more income equality. So being fairly stratified for our chocolate sales, that's actually fairly good news, because it means that there are people there who can afford expensive liqueurs and who can afford luxury items like good chocolate. Macroeconomic indicators we actually looked at a minute ago, and that's GDP, but let's not just take a snapshot of time. Let's think about GDP. Is it growing or is it shrinking? That's extremely important. So that is also captured in the CIA World Factbook, and we can jump to that for a minute. Let's go back to Mexico and scroll down so we can see the GDP, and we can look at the growth rate. Is Mexico growing? Well, it is, but very, very slowly, and some of that could be due to their political challenges. And then last, but certainly not least, is we want to look at the inflation rate. Okay, and let's see what that looks like for Mexico. Okay, if a country has high inflation, it's fairly unlikely that the folks are going to want to purchase your products, because their money is becoming worth less and less and less. So at the moment, Mexico's actually looks fairly reasonable at 4%. In the next section, we'll take a look at government policies.